Hello and welcome to the Transfers podcast powered by FootballTransfers.com, where we bring you news, insight and analysis on that most important of the least important things, football. I'm Ronan Murphy and I'm delighted to be joined by Duncan Castles as always, as well as the big boss Paul Macdonald, the co-founder of the Real Times network, of which FootballTransfers.com is one of the websites, and a financial expert. So we should be informed and entertained by the guests today. Welcome, guys.
Good to be back with you, Ronan. Good to have you on the podcast again, Paul.
Thanks, Duncan. Thanks for having me.
So this episode we'll be talking about a legal case that threatens European football transfer system, as well as the big plans by Man United's head coach to turn them into Premier League champions, as well as some of the key deals in the final month of the summer window. So I suppose we better get started on the one of those key deals. It's Benjamin Sesko, that Duncan said on last week's episode was Sean Connery's favourite footballer. I wonder, is he going to try the impersonation again?
I was hoping you'd do it. I teed that up for you and then you avoided it.
I used to do a Connery impression. I'm not sure. Speaking to two Scotsmen, how well I'll get on with it. But it was based on the Catherine Zeta-Jones film Entrapment, and she goes to him, "This is entrapment," and he goes, "No, this is blackmail. Entrapment is what cops do to thieves." So that's my Sean Connery.
Not too bad. This has been an entertaining bit of back and forth between two Premier League clubs who desperately need a striker over the past week over Benjamin Sesko. Interestingly, not the first choice for either club entering this market, but needing a centre forward. Newcastle United leading the race through the week in that they had an offer accepted first by Leipzig of €82.5 million guaranteed and €2.5 million in contingent payments, having started off at €75 million guaranteed. And Leipzig eventually having to sell for a lower guaranteed fee to Manchester United of €76.5 million, with the €85 million made up in what have been described to me as easy bonuses. So €8.5 million of contingent payments there. And Manchester United also offering Leipzig a friendly in their stadium, which it's estimated will be worth another €1.5 million. Been some interesting briefing from the players' side that Sesko did not choose Manchester United because they offered him better money. In fact, the brief is that he accepted lower wages, lower personal terms, and that his agent accepted a lower commission to go to Manchester United. And I think in this case, there's a certain credibility to that claim because Newcastle are actually in the Champions League this season. Newcastle are waiting on what will be the record transfer sale, assuming it goes through, and we'll talk about this later in the podcast, of Alexander Isak. And probably their need for Sesko was greater than Manchester United. I think there's also a major role played here, as we discussed in last week's podcast, by United's head of recruitment, Christopher Vivell, who's been photographed in Germany with Sesko as they prepared to fly to Manchester last night. He'll take his medical today, and that deal is expected to be formally announced later today. And Vivell was the scout for Red Bull Salzburg when Sesko was taken from Slovenian football to Austrian football. And it was also the director of football at Leipzig when he moved from Salzburg to Leipzig, one of the other clubs in Red Bull's European multi-club network. So you have that long-established relationship there, where Vivell betting on the player from a young age and looking at his development through the Red Bull system, and then convincing Ruben Amorim that if he wanted a kind of battering ram physical forward of the type of Viktor Gyökeres, who they failed to get, Gyökeres choosing to go to Arsenal instead, that Sesko was the correct solution for them. And I think you can see that that ability, that personal relationship, has helped sell Manchester United to the player. And in contrast, you have Newcastle United operating without a chief executive, operating without a director of football. One of their minority owners, Jamie Ruben, doing the direct or part of the direct negotiations to try and convince the player to come to Newcastle United. So, a lot of positives there for Manchester United. But I think a broader context to consider. What are your thoughts on this deal, Paul?
This deal takes United summer net spend at the minute somewhere between 220 and 230 million, with Sesko and Cunha and Buemo. No one has went out the door yet, although the Garnacho deal, as we might discuss, to Chelsea might bring that net spend a bit closer to parity. But it's just another gigantic summer spend for United, and they seem to still be quite inept at getting money in the door to offset that. A lot of the players that they thought they could get money for, Garnacho's been a long-running one, but also Kobe Mainoo was one that they were looking to potentially sell because he was homegrown and because they could bank 100% of that fee. Even other players like Hojlund, who might end up going to Serie A, but they're not going to get anywhere near what they spent on him. It's just another big risk, I think. I think Sesko is a player with a lot of talents that would suit the Premier League in his style, but he's not coming off the back of a blistering goal-scoring season where he's coming into this league full of confidence, ready to rip it up. I think he got 10 non-penalty goals last season in the Bundesliga from 30 starts, which is not exactly kind of world-changing for him. And the other element is, if you look at what other teams do, they kind of enhance their squad by picking departments to kind of at certain points of the summer to build that team around them and enhance them, whereas United are basically constructing an entire new attack here from three players that have never met each other. I think these signings probably were necessary because we know how weak United were in attack last season and how little options Ruben Amorim had, but it's at the expense of probably other parts of the team that needed equally remedying. I mean, their central midfield needed looked at. Defence still wasn't great. Goalkeeper still has a question mark. But they seem to have spent all their money on the one area of the pitch, and it'll be interesting to see how Amorim's 3-4-3 formation, how he possibly balances this, and also gets Fernandes into this team as well, because he is the first name on the team sheet. So I think he's a player with real potential, but again, they've overpaid because of where the market is for strikers and also where United's standing is across Europe. I just think that that's a lot of money to spend on three guys that have to come together very, very quickly to make sure United hit the ground running this season.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think whenever you change an entire section of the team like that, you've got the usual question marks about players fitting in, adapting to new surroundings. Obviously, they've tried to minimise these elements by picking in two of the players, in Matheus Cunha and Bryan Mbeumo, players who have demonstrated Premier League records and success, and the idea is that's going to translate direct into their team. Now, that can't be guaranteed. You're putting them into a different environment, you're putting them into a different tactical system, and Mbeumo in particular, you're asking him to play a very different way from the way he's played at Brentford, unless Amorim changes his system, and we'll talk about it later in the podcast. There's no indication he'll do that. So that's an issue, I think. I think you're absolutely right to highlight the inefficiency of the spend. Interesting little bit of information that's come out from Slovenia is that Manchester United offered Zali, the club where Sesko developed, 1.6 million euros for Sesko when he was a 16-year-old, and they chose to sell him instead to Salzburg for an initial 2.5 million euros. Clearly, partly on Vivel's insistence that Salzburg should pay extra for the player. Dom Zali also took a big additional payment when he moved on to Leipzig. Now, of course, you can't guarantee that Sesko comes to Manchester United at 16. He turns into the player he is now. And again, I'd refer listeners back to last week's podcast about whether the player he is now is going to turn into the player that Manchester United want, which is a dominant, top-class Champions League striker for the next 10 years. And we relayed some information about people involved at a high level in the transfer market, who've talked to Sesko directly, looked at signing him earlier in his career and came to the conclusion that mentally he didn't have what it took to become a top player. They may be wrong, Manchester United may be right, but what's clear is that 6 years later, they're paying 50 times what they offered for Sesko. I think the key question is whether they got the right player. It's only 2 years ago that they signed a 20-year-old centre-forward for almost exactly the same transfer fee as they're paying for Sesko. They paid 75 million guaranteed at Atlanta plus 10 million in bonuses for Rasmus Hojlund, who they've now placed on the market, made it clear that they're prepared to sell him for less than half that sum. So they got it wrong last time. It's a different recruitment team. Maybe they get it right this time. But what you can say is they definitely have not got their first choice in the market. And they've definitely gone up against some of the top clubs in the Premier League. And while there's this great celebration that they've beaten Newcastle United to the player, and the player apparently has taken a lower salary because he preferred to join Manchester United over Newcastle United. If you zoom back a bit, you can say Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool have all been in the market for strikers this summer. Arsenal chose Viktor Gyökeres over Sesko, and Gyökeres chose Arsenal over Manchester United. Manchester United tried to get him. They had the card of Ruben Amorim to play there. It didn't work. Gyökeres prepared to go to a club where he thought he could win things immediately. Chelsea have gone for João Pedro and Liam Delap over Sesko. Manchester United also tried to get Delap, who had a £30 million release clause. Delap chose Chelsea over Manchester United. And Liverpool have chosen Hugo Ekitike, who Manchester United inquired after, and Alexander Isak. Not done the Isak deal yet, but that's three of the top clubs in England who should be the direct competition for Manchester United and what they want to achieve, all deciding to go for different strikers than the one Manchester United are now celebrating signing for a price which you can pretty much say is top of the market and certainly top of the expectations that Leipzig had for the player.
Yeah, I think there's a level of strategising there that United just have been incapable of doing. Like Liverpool's lack of business last summer, keeping their powder dry to go really big this summer. There was strategy in place and there was a thought process there. United clearly had no real thought process over this transfer situation for quite a while now, and it's difficult to plan ahead when everything you're doing has to be so reactive. And I think it's just testament to where United are in the market. There's not really much they can offer a player from the on the pitch perspective right now. They can't guarantee them anything. Finished 15th in the league last season. Yes, they got to Europa League final, but there's no Champions League, so there's no real draw for a player there. It's been the death of many players that have went there over the last few years. You just need to look at Hojlund, who, as you say, Duncan, they thought he was going to be this guy for the next 10 years, and he most clearly isn't. So you have to take that into account. The players are looking at United and going, do I want my career to go like that? And in some cases, players are willing to take the risk, like Sesko clearly is. But other teams that have been far clearer in their strategy have been able to kind of entice players for other more legitimate reasons, and that's just where United's standing in the market, unfortunately, is right now.
Yeah, this is a team who are kind of competing with a different class of calibre of team that they would have been competing with in the past. Man United would have seen themselves as a top four club, but if you look at who they're signing, who they're battling for signings, other players, like Duncan said, Gyökeres choosing Arsenal, etc. United are just kind of shopping in a different department store at the moment. It's just the kind of way that Man United have gone, and you look at the signing of Sesko and the amount they've paid for him, and you wonder, is it an element of familiarity for Vivell? Because anytime he talks about him, or you see quotes of Vivell talking about Sesko, he's talking that he's kind of this kind of unicorn player, that he's tall and technical, and he's mobile and strong, and all these things. He kind of sees this guy as an ideal player. But like you said, Paul, he doesn't really have the stats for the last couple of seasons to back up with. And I know there was posts from Manchester United fans going around on social media during the week showing that at 22 this player had this amount of goals and that player had a different amount of goals, and Sesko has over 100 goals at 22. But some of them were for Liefering in Austria, some were Salzburg in Austria as well. So you can kind of tie into the fact where Duncan was saying that Man United have bought 2 Premier League players to go in this attacking trio, but what a step up it's going to be for Sesko to play in that attack with these players he's never played with before, playing in the Premier League against the best teams in the world. It's going to be such a kind of learning curve, and we wonder, will he have the same sort of experience that Hojlund had? Is he going to be just Hojlund 2.0?
I think that's part of the risk here. And again, you have to credit Vivell in that he's managed to convince the player, despite all the things that Paul is saying there, and despite what other players are doing, and looking at Manchester United in a sceptical fashion, he's managed to convince them to go to Manchester United ahead of Newcastle United. And he clearly has a huge amount of belief in the player. And I think it's also a good thing to have that much invested in a player, and that Vivell will push to ensure that his big recommendation to a club he's not been working for that long works. He's got a lot invested in seeing Sesko succeed in terms of his long-term status at the club. So that can help too. But in the background, and Paul referred to this, you've got a player like Alejandro Garnacho, who not that long ago was perceived as being the best young talent at Manchester United. We're talking about the idea that it wouldn't be too long before Real Madrid stepped in to try and bring him to Spain, given the way he was performing. That was a discussion amongst the support. At the moment, he's being pushed out of the club because Ruben Amorim doesn't want him there. And as Paul mentioned, they're actively discussing a move to Chelsea at present, with Chelsea having convinced Garnacho to join them. Personal terms agreed there, and the discussion being over the transfer fee that will be paid to United for that young talent who they've decided to discard.
Yeah, you go to Man United at the moment and it kind of becomes just a gamble for your career as a player. So we just have to wait to see what happens with Sesko and how his career is going to play out there. It's going to be kind of one of the storylines, and it's going to be fastly followed. But we were speaking as well, obviously, about Newcastle being in for Sesko, and they're looking for a striker themselves. And do you have any update on their current striker that is an exiting striker, on Alexander Isak?
I think it will be a great surprise if Isak doesn't leave now. We've moved to a stage of this transaction, of this attempt to move, where Newcastle are actually criticising Isak publicly for the first time, in that Isak was not allowed to train with the players when he returned from his solo training at Real Sociedad, having not gone on their pre-season tour. And Eddie Howe was asked why Isak wasn't allowed to train. He said, "You have to earn the right to train with us. We are Newcastle United. Player has a responsibility here to be part of a team and part of a squad. You have to act in the right way." So that is also at play here. No player can expect to act poorly and train with the group as normal. Now, that's a significant step up, because Howe had gone out of his way to avoid critiquing Isak through this process. Obviously, Liverpool have now made a formal offer, and that's been sitting there for a week. It's been rejected. According to Howe, he wasn't even consulted before it was rejected by the club, which I'm told is £110 million guaranteed was the initial offer. Liverpool having previously verbally floated the idea of paying £120 million for the player. Liverpool have now managed to shift one of their high-earning players off the wage book and collected €53 million in transfer fee from Al Hilal in Saudi Arabia by selling Darwin Nunez to the Saudi Pro League. So that assists them in balancing books and amortization of transfer fee and bringing cash in to pay the first tranche of the Isak fee. As we talked about last week, the problem for Newcastle United is they still haven't managed to develop a market for the player. There's no competitive tension on Isak. There doesn't seem to be anyone else bidding who the player is interested in going to, having decided that he wants to go to the English champions. So they have to negotiate their way through that problem and see how much extra they can squeeze from Liverpool without having a great deal of leverage at play there. One thing they have done this week, which I thought was quite interesting, is kind of refloated the idea that they will try and get Marc Guehi from Crystal Palace this summer, having failed with multiple bids for the England defender last summer. Interesting because, of course, as we've highlighted in the podcast, Guehi is Liverpool's first choice to add at centre-back, having sold Gerald Kwanzaa to Leverkusen. And again, my information is that Guehi's preference is to move to Liverpool. So perhaps Newcastle kind of messing a little bit with Liverpool in response to what they did with Hugo Ekitike and what they're doing with Isak. But I'm not sure how much success they can have there if the player, Guehi, insists on going to Liverpool, and it would be a huge surprise were Guehi to choose to move to Newcastle United as they are at the moment, when he has 1 year left in his contract, and if Steve Parish elects not to sell him this summer, he gets a free choice of club gets to negotiate a free choice of club in 6 months' time anyway.
Yeah, it's got to be a big kind of talking point between Newcastle and Liverpool fans. Again, I think they're both battling for the same player, and Newcastle, they're a team that have qualified for the Champions League, but the way they're operating in the transfer market at the moment, and the way that people are kind of not going to them at the moment, they don't have that feel. How do you think Newcastle are this summer, Paul?
I think it's been an absolute disaster. Don't think there's any other way to sugarcoat it. Every conceivable target that they've looked at hasn't landed. It's the worst possible time for them to have the kind of boardroom upheaval that they're having in the background. Based on anecdotal conversations you're seeing, Ruben, about how Richard Hughes has been doing business at Liverpool and how he negotiated the Diaz deal, for example. It just seems night and day in terms of how they do things versus how Newcastle are scrambling to do things right now, and it seems as if Eddie Howe is having to pick up quite a lot of the slack on that side of things, as well as managing the team and trying to get them ready for what he already knows is a completely different calendar when you're having to play Champions League as well as Premier League every weekend. It's just the intensity of it is so much, and you've now obviously got 8 group games instead of 6. It's just a monumental task to get a team ready for that, and you need a really, really deep squad to do it. And at the moment, Newcastle don't seem equipped enough to have a real go at the top 4 again, let alone play Champions League too. So the interesting thing for me, and I think that deserves a bit more of a scrutiny, is why the Isak waited until some other deals were done. For example, Ekitike to Liverpool. I think Liverpool would have wanted to do both deals anyway, as I understand, but it's interesting that he really threw his toys out the pram after some deals had already been done. Duncan, have you got any insight into why he waited so long to put the formal request in?
I'm not sure he has put a formal request in yet. I don't know if there's a written request. Obviously, that has implications for him in terms of a negotiating position once he formally asks to leave, because he'll then not be owed salary on his residual contract at Newcastle. You could interpret it as, and I don't know this because I haven't checked it, you could interpret it as it suits him to have waited. For the reasons we've just explained, there is only one serious suitor for his services, because Arsenal have bought, because Chelsea have bought. Manchester United decided to go a different direction. Their brief was that the cost of the Isak deal would be too expensive, so they didn't go there. So if you're looking at it from Isak's perspective, and he has decided to go to Liverpool, which is our understanding, then this is kind of perfect for him, because it now allows Liverpool to keep the transfer fee as tidy as possible, pushing more of the overall package into his salary and signing on fee. That would be one interpretation. Look, it's interesting. You mentioned Eddie Howe's position. I think it's correct. He's placed in a difficult position. It's kind of a ramification of the fight. It's not fair to say the fight he picked with Paul Mitchell, because I think Paul Mitchell started the fight when he came in as sporting director with Eddie Howe. But it is a ramification of Eddie Howe winning that fight and Paul Mitchell handing in his notice and leaving, that they don't have a director of football in place, and that the people close to Howe are handling the market again, and he's had to step in again and put more work towards it. Other centre-backs, there's been an offer in the past week for Malick Thiaw, Milan's 23-year-old German centre-back. I understand that was for €30 million. My guidance earlier in the window was that Thiaw was keen to move to the Premier League, and he'd been aware of Newcastle's interest for a while, and therefore rejected an offer from Como, which Milan had accepted, of 25 million. His status at Milan is now proved, in that new coach Max Allegri wants him in the team, and the briefing from Milan is that they won't sell unless a really big offer arrives. He could still be the alternative, assuming they don't get Marc Guehi. Striker, they really are in a horrible position. They have no number 9 of any experience in the squad at present. They used Anthony Gordon as the central striker in one of their pre-season games. Players they've definitely looked at include Ollie Watkins, who Aston Villa will sell if the numbers are right. Jurgen Strand-Larsen at Wolves. Again, I think a deal could be done there if they push the transfer fee high enough. The 2 players at Paris Saint-Germain they've inquired about. We talked about Randall Kolo Muani a few weeks ago. That is definitely a possibility, because Juventus haven't met Paris Saint-Germain's asking price for the player and want to make it contingent on performances. Gonzalo Ramos at Paris Saint-Germain is another option that Newcastle United, I understand, have inquired about. And then you're also looking at Nicholas Jackson, who'd been considered as a fallback option at Arsenal and Manchester United, and is very much available from Chelsea's perspective, having bought 2 new strikers this summer. Enzo Maresca underlining this week that during the window anything can happen. But I think that could also turn out to be quite an expensive deal, because Chelsea have been briefing that they value him at the same level as proven Premier League goal scorers who moved already this summer, citing people like Brian Mbeumo. So, yeah, it's easy to say, but they've not placed themselves in a good position. Newcastle are also looking at Samu Aguiova, the Spain international at FC Porto, 21-year-old who scored 25 goals in 39 League and Europa League games this season after joining Porto from Atletico Madrid. You may remember last summer that Chelsea were quite close to doing a deal for the player before that transfer fell apart, and André Villas-Boas, as the new president of Porto, stepped in and took him to Portugal instead. The advantage of trying to pursue a player like Samu is that Porto are a selling club, so I think in those circumstances, if you decide he is the right 5th, 6th or 7th answer for Newcastle, then you can do a deal if you come up with the right money for a player like that. They're still waiting on Yohan Wissa from Brentford, with the player underlining that he wants to move. There's a possibility there that the Saudi Pro League may come for Wissa, with Al Nassr and Neom mentioned as candidates. I think that it would be fascinating if that turns into a live fight between Newcastle United and the Saudi Pro League, given that Al Nassr and Newcastle United are funded by the same PIF, Sovereign State Wealth Fund. I don't know what Wissa wants to do, but certainly that category of player, someone who turns 29 in September, who's never earned the sort of top wages that European football can offer, usually that's a happy hunting ground for Saudi Pro League clubs.
Yeah, just one last thing on that. Like, we've basically listed every striker in Europe that's available this summer. Like, that's like, they're not all the same player, right? They've all got different characteristics, and that would be concerning to me as a Newcastle fan. In that you can look at Liverpool's business and you can say they've knocked back this player, or they chose to not go for this player or that player for certain tactical reasons. When the case of this, Howe just wants a warm body to play number 9. I think there's just so many different characteristics between Wissa and Ramos and Jackson across all of them that it's not a case of finding the alternative that fits most into the system. It's just, find me a player, find me a top class centre forward, and I think that would be a real worry if I was a Newcastle fan.
To be fair, they want to, and they've underlined that Wissa is an addition to whoever they take at number 9. But yes, they're definitely getting into that area of the market where it's who can we get to fill a hole, as opposed to who did we want to fill a hole. And we know they missed out on Mbeumo, we know they missed out on Jean Pedro, we know they missed out on Liam Delap, we obviously know they missed out on Sesko, and of course they're losing their best player to the champions.
Another team that the manager is optimistic is Man United, and Ruben Amorim, he gave a nice pre-season interview, a nice lengthy one, 25 minutes and all. So I think since he's arrived at Old Trafford, he's probably spent more time in the interview room than actually managing the team, because things haven't gone perfectly. He has as many wins as losses, 17 in each column, and 8 draws so far. So it's been up and down, but he's promising a brighter future for Manchester United.
Yeah, that's the nice interpretation of his track record. He's probably spent more time in interviews than he has celebrating Premier League wins, given that he has 7 in 27 Premier League games and at an average of 1 point per game. He's a great communicator. We knew that before he came from Portugal. It's one of his great strengths. So it's no surprise that he comes over optimistic and kind of rallying the supporters and rallying the players behind the project. But I think a lot of interesting elements in the interview, talking about his offer to quit Manchester United in the previous season, saying that they always show support for me. If you try to remember one big team that lost so many games and the manager kept their job, you will not find it. And then someone asking him about the average duration of managers post Sir Alex Ferguson as being just 2 years. And his response was that I want to stay 20. That is my goal, and I truly believe in that. Something will happen. In some moments, I will be lucky. I had a lot of luck during my career as a manager, and my idea is to stay for many years. I think in a lot of parts of this interview, he comes across as a man who experienced more stress and difficulty and challenges in a job than he's ever had in certainly his coaching career. He talked about the last part of his playing career, where he had to retire from football after a knee operation as being the most stressful period of his life. But he does come across as someone who's had a break, been removed from the pain of work, and recovered his energies and enthusiasm. There's a lot of what we heard when he came into the club. There is a lot of, we've made changes to the backroom staff, we've made changes to the chefs and the support staff. I'm getting great support from the directors of football and from Omar Barada, and kind of explanations of why things went so badly last season, which was that he decided to focus on the Europa League in order to get Champions League qualification, and basically dumped a number of games towards the end of the season. But there's also this insistence that he's going to play his tactical system that he got so much criticism for last season, and there are no conditions under which he will alter that. said, I'm not the coach who's going to try to survive to put an idea that is not mine. It's the only way I know. Let's build the base. Are we going to suffer? Yes. But he thinks in the long run that sticking to the tactical system he's used throughout his coaching career, shifting out players he doesn't like or he's had fights with, such as Garnacho, Marcus Rashford, and replacing them with, in the main, Premier League proven players, is going to make the difference and set them on a course where they can be Premier League champions again, not this season, but in future seasons.
I like him. I like what he's got to say. I like that United have a statesman that's able to speak on those terms, and I'm sure the club do as well, because I think that was one thing that Ten Hag wasn't very good at. He was quite an abrasive character. He came across as defensive in pretty much every interview he ever had. He was always pushing a somewhat negative angle, I think, in terms of, well, this is the mess I've inherited, etc., etc. And Amorim has done that a little bit, but he's trying to move away from that now and look forward rather than backwards. And I think it's a positive interview. That being said, the squad that he inherited, I think was possibly the least suited squad for a formation that he looks to play. So when he talks about building the base, it becomes extremely difficult to build the base because you're having to build it in every conceivable position. Like, I don't think there's many players that were there when he joined that he would have ideally looked to fit into that system at that point. But it's one that the club chose to back him on, and it's one that he's definitely going to play. And I think the way that they're going about it, in terms of at least giving him the backing, he can be happy with that. What happens to United this season, I really don't know. It's very difficult. It's a basket case. The one thing I would say in their favour is Amorim has had a full summer to coach them, and he's also going to have most of the week to coach them in terms of being ready for the next match, rather than having to juggle Europa League or any of these other competitions. And I think that does help. I think it helps more than ever that you can focus your energy week to week on the game that's coming. People always said the same about Antonio Conte, that he was always the best when the clubs that he were managing didn't have any European football to worry about, and he won the league with Chelsea, obviously, in those circumstances. And I think that's going to really help Amorim to get these players playing in the way that he wants them to play. And I think that will mean an improvement this season, but I still think they're severely lacking in some positions. I don't know if we're going to touch on it, but I know they've been linked with Carlos Baleba from Brighton to kind of shore up that midfield position. I think if they go into the first game of the season and it's Casemiro and Fernandes sitting in the middle of the pitch, I still think they're going to have serious problems, not just against the top teams in the league this season, but against any team that can counter-attack, and there's quite a lot of those in the league. So whilst I think some of the noises are encouraging, I think he has brought in some Premier League proven players. I'm expecting an improvement, but I still think they're lacking in a couple of the key positions that could mean when it comes to the crunch, they still lose games on the counter-attack by just not having the legs in midfield to kind of protect the forwards in such a formation.
Yeah, he emphasised that he wants dynamism in midfield. Interestingly talked about how some of that can come from just having the players understand where they're supposed to be in the pitch better and have their movements more automated relative to each other and what the opponents are doing, so you get more pace into a player like Kobbie Mainoo by him properly understanding Amorim's system. You're right about Baleba. There's been an inquiry as to what it would cost to convince him to join Manchester United, the Brighton's 21-year-old Cameroon international, and a sense of what it would cost to get him out of Brighton. Estimated transfer value from SciSports on Baleba's 55.3 million with a contract until 2028. I think the realistic price to get him out of Brighton at present would be double that. So that does not look like a deal that Manchester United are particularly financially capable of doing at present. We said last week that Amorim had been looking at Hojlund at Sporting, his previous defensive midfielder, and Sporting referring to the €80 million release clause on the Danish midfielder's contract. And this midfield position, I think, it emphasises what you're saying, Paul. The players aren't a good fit to the system. As we assume he's going to play Cunha and Mbeumo behind Sesko, Bruno Fernandes has to go in one of those two midfield slots. And will need a dynamic player beside him. You've got Kobe Mainoo, who has some doubts about in that position. And then you've got Manuel Ugarte, who should be the player for that position, given the money that was spent on him last summer, given the lengths they went to, eventually acceding to Paris Saint-Germain's asking price for the player. And Amorim benched him for the Europa League final, the most important game of the season, last year. And again, we go into SciSports analytics and look at how Ugarte stacked up against other defensive midfielders in the Premier League last season. He's actually in the bottom third on a range of parameters. So he had a terrible first year there, and another example of United making bad choices in the market.
Yeah, they're a team at the moment when they sign players, they sign players who are raw, and maybe Man United isn't the best place to develop them, and maybe a head coach who is so kind of addicted to his particular formation and setup that he's maybe isn't demanded to develop these players. I know obviously a lot of players came through at Sporting and players improved under him at Sporting, but it's a different environment and a different level of expectation, or it's a different level of pressure.
I think Ronan, his track record at Sporting for developing players and taking players that the club had signed for him, not necessarily players he'd asked for, was really good. And we've got to give him an expectation that when he's allowed a say in who comes in for certain positions, and defines the parameters, that if Manchester United give him that player, he will add to that individual. What he doesn't seem to be good at so far is taking a player who's not particularly well suited to his system and re-educating them and getting them to fit. And that's why we're seeing guys like Garnacho going out the door this window. Why we saw Scott McTominay leave last summer, not because of Amorim, that's a decision elsewhere in the club, but again, that Manchester United decision to cash in on someone they don't think is quite good enough for the system, and a year later, here he is being nominated in the 30 players for the Ballon d'Or.
I think that if everyone connected with United, and this is going to sound silly given the expectations of fans, but if everyone connected with that club, including the fans, recalibrates where United were last season and what represents a good season this year, I think Amorim is capable of providing at least some of that. I think, in my opinion, with that squad the way it is right now, I think competing for the top 5, making it look as if they've got a chance of getting in the Champions League, I think that would be a good, acceptable season considering how dire they were last year. Whether that appeases the fans and whether that's what the board are expecting is another story, but I think that would represent real progress because they were a complete and utter shambles last season, closer to relegation than anything else. And if they get that team competitive again and winning matches, I think that would go a long way to giving him the kind of runway that he probably needs in order to get the players that he needs for this formation. But it's all about the start, right? If they start really badly again and are struggling for results and there isn't any progress made, the conversations start to become really difficult for him at that point. So I think if he hits the ground running, they could be okay. But like any United manager, if he's not winning early, then there's going to be questions to be answered.
I think we could move on to the next big topic of the day, and that's something that Paul is an expert on. He's had the latest Football Transfers newsletter, has covered the Justice for Players case that's happening at the moment, where it could be the successor to the Bosman ruling, I suppose, is the simplest way to put it, but you can probably explain it in a bit more detail, Paul, and make it easy for our listeners to understand, because it's a bit complex at the moment.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone can't wait to hear about some more legal wrangling regarding FIFA. So this comes off the Lassana Diarra case from October 24. Now, that's complex in of itself, and Ronan and I did a podcast that goes into that in quite a lot of detail last October, so I would ask our listeners to go and check that one out for more details on it. But essentially, the case was taken that Lassana Diarra had fallen out with his club in Russia, and they had chosen to sack him. But once it went to the court of arbitration, they found that Thiaw was in breach of his contract and he had to pay the club compensation of 10 million euros. Now, in that scenario, Lassana Diarra obviously thought that was unfair. They took the case and ultimately it was found in his favour in October of last year. Now, in his favour, what that exactly means and what the ramifications of that are, we still don't quite know. Depending on who you speak to, it could be the complete implosion of the transfer market, or on the other side, it will require some legal amendments from FIFA that are quite light and quite easy to edit. That means that it won't really have the seismic impact that people think. But off the back of that, there is another group that are calling themselves Justice for Players, and this is a completely different level of impact this would have. The class action is started against FIFA, but it's also against 5 of the league governing bodies in the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, France and Germany. And the argument here is that since 2002, the way that the transfer market has been structured and the way it's been built by FIFA and is operated by these governing bodies, it's unfair for the player, and they are looking to get a class action against these organisations for what they deem to be loss of earnings because of the nature of how the transfer market operates. Now, they're talking about potentially 100,000 players being a part of this action, and they're looking that, on average, a player has lost 8% of earnings due to the restrictive nature of contracts within football clubs. Now, you don't need to be a mathematician to do those sums and realise that could be an unbelievable amount of money, like more money than is available in the transfer market itself. So there are various elements of this which seem a bit bizarre to me, and they seem like something that could conceivably not happen. Not least that amount of money, but also these governing bodies simply facilitated these transfers. They weren't actually actively involved in receiving any funds from it. So if this case were to be found and win, where would the money come from? Because these organisations don't have it. The money went from Team A to Team B in the transfer transaction itself. So that's an issue. But I think the main thing that has made people sit up and take notice of this is one of the main lawyers involved in the case is Jean-Louis Dupont. Jean-Louis is a shameless self-promoter, as other people have pointed out, but he was involved in the Bosman case in 1995, which, as we know, completely changed the structure of transfers within football itself. He was also indirectly involved in the Diarra case from last year, so he clearly knows the landscape very, very well, and if his involvement in this wasn't there, then you could take this full thing, I think, with a pinch of salt. But the fact that he is involved suggests that there could be some meat on the bones here, and there could be something in this. We won't find out any movement now until the beginning of 2026 when they'll start to kind of look into this in a bit more detail. Dupont and the team that he's gathered together are working on a no-win, no-fee. So they'll take a percentage of whatever money is been able to be generated from the case at the end of it if it wins. So it's, again, a real statement of intent there that he's not taking anything up front here. He thinks he can win this case, and by all accounts he's extremely confident. And it's something that's going to take years and years to play out, because even if the court case does happen and it does find in the player's favour and does find injustice for players' favour, there will be appeals and there will be rewritten laws and there'll be a whole load of stuff to go through. So I wouldn't expect anything that really directly actionable in terms of this case for a few years yet at least. But the fact that Dupont is involved in this and the fact that they've been very bullish in terms of what they're asking for means that I think FIFA need to take notice of this and perhaps start preparing for the worst case scenario. And in this case, the worst case scenario is a complete destruction of the transfer market as we know it, because if you think about the Diarra case in particular, contracts and the ability to keep a player within a club organisation are what drives the current transfer system as we know it. And if that were to be torn up, and if a player could walk away at any given moment, then transfers themselves, the fee that you would pay for a player wouldn't be worth the paper it's printed on, because the player can just walk away from that deal. So there's lots of nuance here. That explanation doesn't even cover the half of what's in this, but it's something to very much keep an eye on, because DuPont is serious. He's got previous, he's done it before, and if he does it again, we're going to have a very different transfer system on the other side of this.
So what you're really saying is expect the free transfers podcast to launch in 2026 or whenever this is finally resolved.
Well, if you think about it this way, like football is very unique in the transfer system that we do have, with fees being paid for talent, and that's something that's very unique and very difficult to replicate in other sports. And maybe it's time to actually have a look at that properly and see how fair it is. Now, I'm not going to go all woe is me on professional footballers who are already earning lots of money, but not every professional football player earns 5, 6, 7 million. Quite a lot of them don't. Most of them don't. And most of the ones that would be involved in this class action, probably 8% of salary loss over their career would be a significant amount to them, life-changing amount of money. So I think with transfer stuff like this, we need to not always think about it as 100 million quid deals at the very top end of the market. We need to think about what happens and what the impact would be at the bottom end of the market as well. And I think that's more important than what happens to the players at the very, very top echelon, because they're always going to have clubs, they're always going to have power. But the ones at the bottom, how that would impact the clubs themselves would be a very different environment on the other side.
I think there's a number of things that are worth taking a look at in this case and the whole context of the case. One, I'm not entirely sure that DuPont and the lawyers involved in justice for players are doing this for nothing. As I understand it, the costs are covered by an international litigation funder, Demonor Litigation Funding. So they would cover the lawyers' costs, allowing them to run the case through whatever the outcome. But the players who engage in the class action will not be charged anything unless there is a successful compensation paid to players, and then up to 25% net will be deducted, plus VAT potentially, from anything those players get. That 8% figure, I think, is also something that will be contested in court, in that Justice for Players say it's based on a preliminary analysis by economic experts Compass Lexicon, who think the damages could amount to several billions of euros. So this is an organisation, presumably it's been hired to come up with a number, and that's the number that they think is contestable in court, approximately 8% in lost salary. I think it's super hard to calculate this, given that what they are arguing is that the nature of the transfer system, and there's a couple of specific things that Thiaw won in the European Court of Justice over, which was FIFA preventing national associations from issuing international transfer certificates when a player walked out in his contract, which is what Thiaw was adjudged to have done. And also that when a player walks out in his contract and joins a new club, it was automatically the case that the new club was held jointly responsible for paying compensation to the club that player had walked out on. Those two things the ECJ found to be a contradiction of European competition law. And those two things FIFA responded to in December by rewriting on an interim basis their transfer regulations. And they've set them up in a way that the idea that the new club had induced Thiaw or any other player to breach their contract and join another club would only be responsible if it was demonstrated that they'd induced the player to move. The previous setup had been it was assumed they'd induced the player to move and given him encouragement to move. Another thing that's important in here is that FIFPro, which is a international players union body, has been in basically open conflict with FIFA for some time now. The two organisations issuing press release against each other, FIFPro complaining about not being involved in this rewriting of the transfer rules and insisting that any further changes should go through a process of collective bargaining in which FIFPro would be involved. So it's like a negotiation with FIFA, with the clubs, to establish a new transfer system and a new compensation system when players left their contracts. So there's a broader fight here beyond just the class action case that Justice for Players is taking. In that broader context, I think you've got to go back to the Bosman case and look and see that the current rules and transfer regulations were brought in as part of an agreement between the European Union and FIFA, that there should be rules around transfers, that there should be a process of transfer fees for players under contract, and there should be limitations on players just walking out on their contracts when they have a better offer elsewhere. So the current system is a compromise, and the compromise was put in place in the face of European laws that allow freedom for movement in most employment contexts. The European Union decided that football was a special case, it had cultural significance, and that a set of rules that diverged from European Union law were acceptable to enable football to operate and to keep clubs in existence. And it's not hard to work out if you remove those rules and you're, for example, a young player at Newcastle United, even a club with significant money, and your value goes up so that Liverpool, to pick a club out of the air, want to sign you. If you set up a situation where you can just walk from your contract without compensating your current club, or only having to pay minimal compensation to your current club, and Liverpool are allowed to give you all of the money that they had allocated to that transaction direct to the player and the agent, as opposed to paying any compensation fee to the developing club, then the whole system of development, the whole structure of football as we've known it for decades now, falls apart. And football is not just a cultural enterprise in Europe. It's a massive economic exercise now, in that the Europe's top divisions clubs in 2023, just the top division clubs collected 26.8 billion euros of revenue themselves, which is significant economic impact. But to all of that, you add all the commercial activity that occurs around football to see just how much money football as it stands puts into the economies of European nations. Does the European Commission, does the European Union want to mess with all of that? Because ultimately this is what these legal cases come down to, and ultimately the solution will come down to what the European Union negotiates with the football industry as a way for it to operate going on.
Now, to play devil's advocate on this, Duncan, I think Ronan and I spoke about it in the Diarra podcast, but in some cases, having a long contract is very good for the player, right? Not every player is Erling Haaland, who could turn into some kind of Harlem Globetrotter who could go from team to team as soon as his notice period is up at any given club, which would be nuts. But there are some players that quite happily sit on their contracts, earn good money, and doesn't really matter how well they perform at that club, they get paid, and they'll get paid for the length of the contract unless they go somewhere else. And I think there's a lot of stability and security in the length of these contracts, which benefits the player as much as anything else. And I think the players themselves need to be wary of this and understand that, yes, it would be good for them to be able to walk away at any given moment, but not if they're not playing well, or not if they're injured, or not if other circumstances arise where that 3-year deal that they might have signed becomes a 6-month deal, or a deal where the club is quite equally willing to let you go as you are to walk away. So there's pros and cons at both sides, and I think I completely agree with you. It's always going to come down to money. Where the money goes, can the money stay in the system? And you're not going to destroy a cash cow on a technicality here. And I think that we need to see a bit more detail at the beginning of next year, exactly what they're proposing and what the end result will be, because you know what these cases are like. You always go all guns blazing at the beginning and demand the maximum amount of compensation, when in reality you'd be quite content to find some kind of medium ground on it. And I think that's what we need to establish is, what does the medium ground look like? Can we apply it without completely destroying the system?
I think it's very clear that FIFA hasn't been applying its own rules effectively. Giara was at Lokomotiv Moscow. He had a fight with the coach. They proposed reducing the value of his contract, and that's the reason he walked out. Then FIFA found Giara guilty and charged him 10 million euros, when I think any outsider would say the club has to bear some responsibility in those contexts. So FIFA's dispute resolution committee, which decides on these kind of disputes between players and clubs, failed to do its job properly, then got bounced to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, who supported FIFA. And I don't think this is the first time we've seen the Court of Arbitration for Sport coming up with questionable decisions in the context of big decisions within European and world football. So FIFA's placed itself in a position where it's applied rules that had been agreed with the European Commission in a way that was too favourable for the clubs. That's clear. That needs to change. But to go back to the benefits for footballers, that 26.8 billion euros of revenue in 2023 that I just mentioned, roughly 70% of that goes to footballers and agents. The vast majority of the money that football clubs generate goes to players. We're in a situation, we've just been talking about in this podcast, where one of the top players in the Premier League has pretty much decided, I'm leaving a Champions League club for the champions, and you guys sort it out between yourselves. So we're in an era of player power, probably an unprecedented era of player power with the existing system. I'm not saying there are no flaws in the system, I'm not saying it's being operated correctly, but if FIFPro want to take a good long look at it and ask, how do you rejig this system for the benefit of all of our clients? Is it actually just to say, let's remove these restrictions and allow players to act like they would in other areas of work within the European Union and just resign contracts as and when it suits them? Does that help the game? Does that generate more total revenue for players, or does it damage the game? And I think it's probably the latter.
Yeah, I'd put it to you, like you mentioned the Bosman case there, and how quite a lot of the rules and the discussions with the European Union back then still apply today. Would you think that FIFA have been perhaps asleep at the wheel when it comes to developing the transfer market regulations? Because I've sat in many FIFA briefings in the past where they've spoken about building a transfer system and having ID cards and having like kind of player history, injury history and transfer history all in a centralised database, and they keep mentioning it, and then they change the agent regulations and this and that, but nothing substantial ever really comes out of it. Do you think if they'd been a bit more proactive in terms of evolving the rules, we might not be in this situation?
I think there's an element to that for sure, but I think applying the rules that had been agreed correctly is as important. Essentially, the way they've set it up prevents players from exiting even when they've been messed around by their clubs. So the calculation of the 10 million in Giara's case was the residual salary on his contract and the unamortized amount left from his transfer fee that he was liable to pay, and the next club that signed him or tried to sign him, Charleroi in Belgium, would have been liable to pay. And that becomes so high for the majority of players that effectively prevents players who have been messed around by their clubs from moving. And why do they do it that way? Because it's simple. Instead of looking at the merits of each case and trying to work out a penalty according to what's happened, you just have a blanket rule that it's the residual on the transfer fee and the residual on the contract, which usually is a pretty high number for any player of significance that's likely to be induced to move to another club.
The last thing I would say on it is, I'll try and say this as diplomatically as possible. Perhaps the type of FIFA hierarchy we have at the minute isn't quite conducive to getting round the negotiating table and speaking to people on these terms, as perhaps they might have been under previous control. FIFA at the minute are just trying to piss as many people off as possible as it looks. And I think I've had problems with FIFA Pro in the past in terms of how toothless they have been, but at least they are trying to do a little bit of something around about this at the minute. I don't think Gianni Infantino really cares about FIFA Pro or engaging with them at any level. And I think that's another reason why this could drag out for a long time, because he'll likely just line up the lawyers and drag this out in a similar way to what City have done with the charges to make it go as long as possible, bleed the funds of whoever is putting up the money for the lawyers, and just really make the full thing as agonising as possible.
I think that's a fair point. The current FIFA are not in the habit of doing deals with anyone unless they are the President of the United States or Saudi Arabia.
You're skipping ahead there, guys. That's the villain of the week that you're trying to inject into it. So, well, probably no better time than to pick the hero than now. So, Duncan, who's your hero this week?
I think this week it has to be George Costa, who very sadly and unexpectedly passed away of a heart attack while attending an FC Porto training session on Tuesday as their director of professional football, just 53 years of age. He was the on-field leader of that incredible Porto side that won the 2004 Champions League after winning the 2003 UEFA Cup. Something no club of that dimension's even come close to replicating in the years since. He won the Portuguese League 8 times, played 50 times for Portugal, and if you look at some of the tributes to him from people like Benny McCarthy and Jose Mourinho, both of them in tears when they talked about him this week, I think that just gives you a sense of the dimension of a not just a footballer, obviously he was, but of what kind of man he was, and it's a real sad loss for football.
Yeah, it was a kind of a sad week all round for football, because we had Frank Mill, the 1919 World Cup winner with Germany. He passed away this week of a heart attack. He was only 67. So, yeah, it's been one of them difficult weeks for football, and yeah, we have them from time to time, and it's just good. It's just nice too when people share videos or clips of some of these players, and you get to watch them in the prime, and you kind of forget or are reminded of how good they were or how influential they were. So something maybe more lighthearted about a villain, because after our heroes are our heroes, but the villain of the week I'm going to pick as Darwin Núñez for this week, because we're not going to see his chaos anymore in the Premier League. He was an iconic footballer. He shaved off his iconic hair, and he seemed to have hit the ground running in pre-season for Liverpool, and some Liverpool fans were even saying that here he is, the real Darwin has finally arrived, but the real Darwin is going to have to arrive in the Saudi Pro League instead. And yeah, he's my villain, because I'm going to miss him. I'm going to miss him coming off the bench and being as unpredictable as hitting the post or the woodwork 4 times in one match, or getting sent off on his debut, or scoring an absolute wonder goal in the cup. So yeah, we're going to miss you, Darwin. We're going to miss you.
Maybe he's a reverse Samson, and he's got to shave his head off to become any good at finishing.
We'll have to wait and see how he gets on in the Saudi Pro League, but I'm not sure those stats count as much for other leagues, despite what Cristiano Ronaldo would have you believe.
I'm just shocked that he's not signed for Leipzig, given that Jurgen Klopp had the opportunity to take him for the second time in his football career and passed up on it, strangely.
Yeah, he's probably saw more videos of him this time between now and then, so that could have been the reason. As always, we have our audience survey. The link is in the show notes and on our social platforms. The Football Transfers app is available on the Apple Store. We have the Football Transfers newsletter, like I mentioned a few times, that goes out a couple of times a week, and you can subscribe on the Football Transfer website or on Substack. And as well as that, we have memberships of our YouTube channel if you want to sign up for some special extras and goodies there. You've been listening to the Transfers podcast, powered by FootballTransfers.com. If you like what you heard, spread the word. Please follow, share and rate us. You can message us on Instagram, YouTube and Facebook at Transfers Podcast. Our Twitter, Blue Sky and TikTok address is at TransfersCast. I'm on Twitter at SwearingOutPaul, Instagram at Ronan, at Blue Sky at Ronan Murphy. Duncan is everywhere at Duncan Castles, and Paul is at Paul McDFC. Our production, as always, is by Marc Caulfield at Pro Podcast Production, and our music is by Marc Caulfield and David L. Stay safe, be well, and thank you for listening.
He did the transfer window. Ian McGarry, who left us and was the blue for a couple of years. Duncan was low. Now he's back with a new show. It's called The Transfers. It's where everyone's gonna go. The transfers, the transfers, the transfers. Where everyone's gonna go. Where everyone's gonna go. The transfers, the transfers, the transfers. Where everyone's gonna go. 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 Where everyone's gonna go.